All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to do something really cool, something a little bit different, and go straight to the source to understand a legend.
The legend in his own words.
You got it.
Yeah.
And our listeners, you've asked us to look at some of the primary source material a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to dive deep, no pun intended, into Bruce Lee's fighting method.
Yeah.
This was actually supposed to be Bruce Lee's own book, going way back to 1966, project that he kind of put on hold.
Yeah.
But thanks to his widow, Linda Lee, we have this amazing opportunity to really explore his foundational thinking when it comes to fighting.
And it's not just fighting techniques, which is what's so fascinating. I mean, we get to see the philosophy, the complete philosophy, the physical conditioning, all of which Bruce Lee felt was absolutely essential.
Yeah.
It's his blueprint, for effective self-defense.
It is, in his own words. And we're going to be looking at excerpts from the book that cover things like his core philosophy on martial arts. Then we get into the real practical stuff, the basic training, the on-guard position, which is so important, footwork, how to generate power, and then the speed element.
Yeah.
So really our mission today is to extract some of those core principles directly from Bruce Lee's early thinking on fighting, give you some actionable insights, maybe even some surprising perspectives, all coming from the man himself. So let's get into it. Why don't we start with his overall philosophy when it comes to martial arts?
Right. Well, I mean, you can't talk about Bruce Lee's philosophy without talking about Jeet Kune Do. This was really his concept, and it was born out of his dissatisfaction with traditional martial arts.
Yeah.
One of his most famous quotes is, "You cannot fight in a pattern."
Right.
Because a real attack, as you know, can be unconventional, unpredictable.
Well, I think let's unpack that a little bit, because I think what he was getting at was that traditional martial arts, they were too rigid. They were too bound by these preset sequences.
Right.
And to him, fighting wasn't about rote memorization. It was about the ability to adapt.
Right.
To react fluidly to the chaotic reality of a real fight. So what did he see as the downsides of these rigid traditional forms?
Well, I think the biggest one was that it would make you, the martial artist, predictable.
Yeah.
You're going to do this if this happens, you're going to do that if that happens, and unable to respond effectively to unexpected attacks. So the core of Jeet Kune Do was to be, this evolving process, always adapting to the specific circumstances. He's got a great analogy in the book. He says, the day turns to night and night to day, the way of fighting must also reform. It's got to change.
I love that. And here's a fascinating paradox. Even though he created Jeet Kune Do, he actually wished it didn't have a name. Think about that for a second. And it wasn't just a quirky preference. It really gets at the heart of his belief that any label, even one that he created, could become a limiting form, which really went against his whole philosophy of constant adaptation.
Exactly. I mean, for Bruce Lee, even calling it Jeet Kune Do was, it carried the risk of it becoming another style.
Yeah.
With its own rules.
Right.
Its own dogma, and and then what? You're limited.
Yeah.
And he wanted to be. I mean, his principle was to be formless, like water. Adapting to any container, and so a label, became, this kind of restriction.
Mind blown. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the physical side of things. Chapter 1, the Fighting Man exercise, really underscores how crucial physical conditioning was in Lee's approach.
Right, and this was often overlooked, I think. Martial artists focused so much on technique.
Right.
And Lee felt that was a mistake. That skill without physical conditioning, it just wouldn't cut it.
Yeah.
It wasn't good enough for self-defense.
Right.
And it's funny, he says in the book, skill and performance is all right, but it's not enough to prove you might.
Yeah.
Meaning you can know all the moves,
right,
but if your body gives out, what good are they?
Right. You're not going to be able to execute them.
Right.
And he practiced what he preached. I mean, the guy was an incredible physical specimen.
Unbelievable. I mean, his dedication to training was really remarkable. He trained rigorously, as you know, every day, very disciplined in terms of diet.
Right.
And even when he was traveling, making movies and such, he was committed.
Yeah.
I mean, he packed his running shoes. He found time. And
this daily routine, man, I mean, this is where it gets really intense. He would run 4 miles in 24 to 25 minutes, which is insane. And not only that, he would incorporate things like wind sprints and shuffling to really, vary the workout.
Right.
And then he would immediately get on
Mm.
an exercycle and pedal at 35 to 40 miles per hour for, 45 minutes to an hour.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, this wasn't just general fitness. This was about building the specific types of endurance that you need for fighting.
Yeah.
You need the cardiovascular, you need the leg-specific power.
Well, and I think that was really smart on his part. The running for the cardiovascular, but the high-speed
Yeah.
cycling was really building the specific kind of endurance you need for those bursts of movement,
Yeah.
the leg drive that you need, in fighting.
Absolutely. And then there's skipping rope. Now, he was a huge proponent of skipping rope. And it's interesting because modern physiology is kind of catching up to that, where some studies are saying that 10 minutes of skipping can be as beneficial as 30 minutes of jogging.
Yeah.
But what's important is how he skipped.
Right.
It wasn't just, kind of going through the motions.
Yeah.
He alternated feet, used mostly wrist action to control the rope, kept the hops really short, really light,
Right.
and he even structured his skipping workouts like boxing rounds.
Yeah.
3 minutes intense, 1 minute rest,
Yeah.
and gradually increased that to a continuous 30 minutes.
Yeah. He saw it as a way to build, not just the stamina, not just the leg strength, but coordination,
Yes.
timing, balance. Yeah.
And then we have shadow boxing,
Yeah.
which he talked about a lot. And that wasn't just a warm-up for him. That was a tool to develop your agility, your speed, your imagination, your footwork.
And really visualizing that opponent, right?
Yes.
I mean, to really get in that mindset,
Mentally prepare.
refine the technique.
And what's interesting with shadow boxing is the element of progression that he talked about. You start relaxed, you focus on proper form, light footwork, and then you gradually increase that speed and intensity.
Right.
It's a way to ingrain those techniques and make them more instinctive,
Yeah.
through mental rehearsal and physical execution.
Right.
Now, he didn't sugarcoat it. I mean, he was very clear that hard, continuous exercise was absolutely necessary to build real endurance. You're going to be out of breath, you're going to have sore muscles, you're going to feel it.
Right.
There were no easy routes for Bruce Lee.
He pushed himself, and he expected you to push yourself as well.
Yeah. And he really understood, that principle of interval training,
Right.
where you're alternating between those longer periods of sustained exercise
Yeah.
and then those short bursts of high intensity.
Right.
And that's how you build the endurance that you need to really exert yourself in those moments when you have to during a fight.
Right. Because a fight's unpredictable.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Now, he also outlined the importance of warming up
Right.
before any intense training. This is to prevent injuries, maximize your performance. And he even noted that the duration of your warm-up should, kind of be adjusted based on things like the temperature outside
Oh, that's interesting.
and
Yeah.
the time of day.
Yeah.
This shows that he really understood how the body responds to those different conditions.
Well, right. Because, I mean, if it's cold, your muscles are going to be less pliable.
Right.
First thing in the morning, same thing. So you're going to need a little bit more time to get warmed up.
And then he has this section where he talks about beneficial versus hindering exercises.
Yeah.
And he really emphasizes avoiding what he calls antagonistic tension in muscles.
So don't do exercises where your muscles are fighting each other.
Right. Waste of energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Right. And I think that's pretty insightful for back then. I mean, he really had a grasp of biomechanics,
Yeah.
and recognized that exercises that caused those opposing muscle groups to contract at the same time.
Yeah.
If it impeded your speed, it created wasted energy. And so, he contrasted that with those more dynamic, more rapid activities, the ones that promote fluid motion.
So now we get to chapter 2, the on-guard position.
Okay.
This is where we really get into, the nuts and bolts of of his fighting method.
Right. This is the fundamental stance.
Yeah.
The bedrock of Jeet Kune Do. So we talked about all that physical conditioning. Now we need to have the right stance.
Yeah.
So the on-guard position was much more than just a way to stand. It was a posture. It was a strategic posture optimized for both attack and defense.
Yeah.
And he described it as a balanced semi-crouch, stable, ready to move, but not telegraphing your intentions.
Yeah.
And he even talks about creating this empty body illusion.
Yeah, the empty gaudy illusion. So
Yeah.
so basically you're not giving away your next move.
Right.
You're kind of this blank slate to your opponent.
Exactly. Unpredictable.
And he also really emphasizes the advantages for mobility.
Yeah.
The quick small steps you can take while still maintaining balance, and then that subtle masking of the timing of your movements.
And because your lead hand and foot are closest to the opponent,
Right.
they become the primary tools for initiating strikes, right?
Yes.
And he says, I think in most encounters, like 80% of your hits are going to come from the lead hand and the lead foot.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, this might surprise some people, but Bruce Lee,
Mm.
even though he was a natural right-hander, he adopted a southpaw stance, leading with his left. So why the unorthodox choice?
It was all about maximizing the advantage, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he felt that the stronger limbs should be the ones leading,
Right.
the ones doing most of the work. And so for him, it was the right hand and the right foot. Yeah.
So it makes sense to lead with the left.
It's counterintuitive though, right?
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
for a right-handed person to flip it like that,
Yeah.
it's were there any downsides that he talked about, or did the advantages just, completely outweigh everything else in his analysis?
I don't recall him talking about downsides. I think he felt like, if you train that way,
Yeah.
it becomes natural.
Right.
I know.
And he gets really specific in the instructions.
Right.
For the southpaw on guard position. So chin and shoulder should meet about halfway. The right shoulder slightly raised for protection, chin slightly dropped, all to protect that vulnerable point of the chin.
Right.
I mean, this really shows his meticulous approach to even the most basic elements.
Exactly. I mean, every aspect of the stance.
Right.
From the head to the shoulders, everything has a purpose.
Yeah.
And it's about being defensive, but also ready to attack.
Yeah. And then he goes into head positioning and close fighting. Yeah.
Where he talks about, that vertical alignment,
Yeah.
the edge of the chin pressed lightly to the collarbone, one side kind of tucked towards that lead shoulder.
Right.
But he does mention that more extreme defensive maneuver of really tucking the chin.
Right.
But he generally advises against that. So why is that? Why not just always tuck the chin?
Well, because I mean, if you fully tuck your chin, yeah, you're protecting that area,
Right.
but you're creating tension, in the lead, shoulder, and arm,
Yeah.
and that can hinder your movement. It can lead to fatigue.
Yeah.
Because you're not loose.
Right. You're not in that optimal, kind of skeletal alignment.
Exactly. So it's a trade-off,
Yeah.
between ultimate defense and being able to move and attack.
All right. So let's move on to chapter 3, footwork. This is where he makes it very clear that mobility is the essence of fighting.
Yeah. He's got this great, analogy where he talks about, the fighter's movement. He says, a stallion galloping with grace instead of a kangaroo leaping high in space.
I like that.
And it's about being fluid. It's about being efficient. It's about moving continuously.
Yeah.
Not these big telegraphed actions that are easy to counter.
So basically, if your footwork is slow, you're going to be slow with your strikes.
Yeah.
The speed of your footwork equals the speed of your hand and foot strikes.
Mm-hmm.
And the core principle is pretty simple but profound. You're constantly trying to seek your target or to avoid being a target.
And he really contrasts that with the traditional horse stance.
Yeah.
That he found to be, really slow and awkward.
Yeah.
And not functional in a real fight.
Because you got to be able to move in all
You
directions.
gotta be able to change direction.
And you can't be stuck in this, kind of static position.
Exactly.
So proper footwork, according to Bruce Lee, isn't just about being fast. It's about maintaining balance
Yes.
while you're in motion.
Yes.
And that balance contributes to your power and your ability to avoid being hit.
Right.
And he even goes so far as to say that good footwork can overcome almost any kick or punch.
So if you're moving,
Yeah.
you're hard to hit.
Right. You're basically reducing the predictability of your movements.
Right.
So the opponent, it's harder for them to target you.
Right. Exactly.
And then, beyond just evading, he says that effective footwork allows you to do things like close the distance to your opponent, escape from a corner, and conserve energy for those counterattacks.
Right.
So even if you're if you have a really powerful striker who has terrible footwork,
Right.
they're going to tire themselves out,
Absolutely. Just trying to chase you.
just chasing you down. And they're going to be vulnerable. So he says the feet should always be positioned directly beneath the body,
Right.
which gives you that stable base.
Right.
So you can move in any direction, but you're always balanced.
And that's what the on-guard position facilitates.
Exactly. Now let's talk about chapter 4, power training.
Right.
And right off the bat, he wants to debunk this misconception that hitting power is all about strength.
Right. Raw brute strength.
Right.
And he uses the example of boxers,
Yeah.
who may not look particularly muscular,
Right.
but they can punch like a mule kicks, right?
Yeah.
and he says the real power comes from impetus and speed.
Right.
And he used a perfect example.
Yeah.
I mean, he only weighed, 130 pounds, but he could hit with tremendous force.
Right.
And that was because of his speed,
And his technique.
and his technique.
Yeah. So the Jeet Kune Do principle for generating power is this whole body participation.
Right.
It's not just your arm.
Right.
You're using your hips, your shoulders, your feet, your arm, everything working together.
In a coordinated way.
Yes. And the punch should originate from the center of your body.
Right.
He talks about the force traveling in a straight line from the center out to the point of impact. He even uses your nose
Oh, wow.
as a guide, right,
Right.
to ensure that straight trajectory.
Right. So everything's aligned.
Yes. And he emphasizes straight punches, straight kicks,
Yes. Yeah.
because those are based on body leverage,
Right.
And he says the arms and legs are the bearers of force,
Right.
but the body provides the power.
Right.
Right.
It all starts in the core.
You got to have that balance, got to have that alignment.
Yeah.
The lead foot is so important. And then before he even gets into the really detailed stuff about power, he makes this really important point about clenching your fist
Yes.
and that you have to do it correctly to avoid injury.
Right.
I think that's something that a lot of beginners overlook.
Yeah. It's a small detail, but it's important.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Because if you're punching with power, you're going to hurt yourself if you don't clench your fist correctly.
Right.
So finally we get to chapter 5, speed training. And here he kind of broadens our understanding of what speed is in fighting. It's not just about fast hands and feet.
Well, and it's about, awareness.
Yeah.
It's about non-telegraphic moves.
Right.
It's about, it's the whole package.
Coordination, balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the ultimate aim of cultivating speed, he says, is to hit without being hit.
Right. Which makes sense.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then he also says that speed on its own is not enough.
Right. Because if you don't have any power behind it,
Right. What good is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to be a successful fighter, you got to have both.
You got to have both.
Speed and power.
The two sides of the coin.
Yeah. And he talks about this concept of the snap or the whip,
Right.
just before impact.
Right.
Right before impact.
To increase the speed of your strike at the point of contact. And he uses those great analogies, like flicking your wrist when you throw a baseball.
Right.
Or the crack of a whip.
Right. It's that last second acceleration that maximizes the force.
It's not just about, winding up and swinging as hard as you can.
Right.
It's about that snap at the end.
Right. It's about generating that velocity.
Yeah.
At the last second.
So before we wrap up, I think it's important to remember, the man behind these methods.
The legend.
Bruce Lee, his story is just fascinating.
It is from Wing Chun,
Yeah.
studying under Yip Man.
Yeah.
To his dedication to learning.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a philosopher. He was an innovator.
Yeah.
He was an amazing martial artist.
And he didn't just, stick with Wing Chun. I mean, he branched out. He studied all these different martial arts.
Right. Developed his own philosophy.
Well, and Jeet Kune Do wasn't just about, physical training. It was about, I mean, he studied philosophy at the University of Washington.
Right.
It was about his own personal experiences. Yeah. It was a really holistic.
Yes. And let's not forget, he combined all of that with acting and filmmaking.
Right.
He brought this whole new level of realism and depth to action movies.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's remarkable how much he accomplished in his, unfortunately short life.
Right. And his death was a huge loss.
Yeah.
But, his writings,
Yeah.
Bruce Lee's fighting method compiled by M. Uehara,
Yeah.
it's allowed his knowledge, his
Yeah.
philosophy to live on.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Right.
we've really explored this holistic approach to training, and it's so much more than just learning, the punches and the kicks. It's about building that physical foundation.
Right.
It's about, having a stance that gives you balance and mobility.
Yeah.
You got to understand how to generate power.
Right.
You got to cultivate speed.
Right.
But then underpinning all of that is this philosophy of constant adaptation.
Right. And rejecting those rigid forms.
Exactly. And I think what's so insightful is how everything is connected, right?
Right. It's a system.
It's a system.
It's not just, a bunch of random techniques.
Right.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah. His philosophy informs his training.
Yeah.
And the training supports, the techniques.
Yeah.
It's just this beautiful ecosystem of self-improvement. So here's our final thought for you. Take a moment and think about how this emphasis on adaptation, on rejecting rigid forms, could apply to other areas of your life.
Oh, that's interesting.
Not just martial arts,
Yeah.
but anything where you're trying to learn, anything where you're trying to grow.
Right.
How do you find that balance between foundational training,
Right.
and allowing yourself that individual expression, that evolution, breaking free from those limiting structures?
Right.
It's something to think about.
Definitely.
So until our next exploration, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Absolutely.
See you next time.